lecture is about cell theory and basic types of cells. The invention of the microscope was a huge advancement for science. It was a really big deal for scientists to be able to now see cells because they had no idea what tissues were made of. They weren't able to see anything smaller than you could see with the naked eye. So by the 1830s, most biologists were using the microscope as an investigative tool to let them learn more about organisms and see what those organisms were composed of. Anton van Leeuwenhoek was credited with discovering the microscope. Many people around the world were using similar tools at this time. He's just the one that for some reason got the credit for doing so. But there's many other people, and you might find other names in some other sources, and which have been also credited with this discovery. His magnifying glass looked like this, or his microscope looked like this, where you would put the specimen on the microscope here and look through this lens. It could only magnify by about 200 times, but that's still large enough to be able to see cells. We're going to talk about the contributors to cell theory, and these are scientists that their work allowed the cell theory to be, the cell theory was able to be produced. The first one is Robert Hooke, a very attractive gentleman, as you can see. Robert Hooke was really the first person to look at cells, and he was the first person to name them. He looked at cork cells, like the bark of a cork tree or the cork that you would find in a wine bottle, but they're not living. They were just dead plant cells, so all he could see was the outside of the cell. They're dead plant cells. You can see the small squares. It kind of look like this. This is a drawing of it. And when he looked at it, it reminded him of a monastery, which is a place where monks live. Here's an example of a monastery. Or you might think of it as like dorm rooms, something like that, where you could actually see little individual rooms in a large building. Because it looked to him like a lot of little individual rooms in a building, he called them cells, like the monastery cells. And the name kind of stuck. Robert Brown is an individual who discovered the nucleus. He was able to see the nucleus here. These are the darker spots in the center of the cell. He didn't name them a nucleus. He was just the first person to notice that cells had them. Now we call it a nucleus, but Robert Brown was the one to discover it. Matthias Schleiden was a botanist, and a botanist is somebody who studies plants. He was obviously really happy about it too. And he was the first person, after looking at many, many different types of plants, he came to the conclusion that all plants were made of cells. So he looked at every type of plant that he could find, found that they all had this same structure, and therefore said that all plants were made of cells. Somebody that came right after him, Theodor Schwann, did the same thing with animals. He looked at all different types of animals and made the generalization that all animals are made of cells. Those are some pretty sweet mutton chops he has going on right here. These are some cheek cells. This is muscle cells here. But because he could determine that all animals were made of cells, he also looked back on Schleiden's work, combined his work with Schleiden, and said that all organisms are made of cells. So we know that all plants are made of cells and all animals are made of cells, so he proposed that all organisms were made of cells. Robert Virchow was a German doctor, and he noticed how cells in general could only come from pre-existing cells. That people used to think that cells could be born from inanimate objects. People thought that mice were born from wheat, or that flies were born from rotting meat. Because they noticed that flies would come out of rotting meat. They didn't take into account that a fly could have possibly laid eggs there. So there were several experiments that were done to discredit that. Rudolf Virchow was the one who said that all cells must come from pre-existing cells. So from these scientists' work, we now have what we call the cell theory. And cell theory has 3 principles. Those 3 principles are: cells are the basic unit of life. That just means that all cells, or cells are the smallest living thing. Although cells are made up of organelles, organelles themselves are not living. Cells are the smallest living thing. Also, all organisms are made of 1 or more cells. We know that things like bacteria and amoebas only have 1 cell, but larger things like plants and animals are composed of many, many cells. And the third principle is that all cells arise from pre-existing cells. So a cell is not born from nothing. A fly's cell does not come from rotting meat. There has to be an existing cell in order to make a new cell. So you will need to know those three principles of cell theory for the exam and also the final exam. So make sure you jot those down and take some notes. Okay. The cell theory emphasizes that all organisms are composed of cells and that they're the fundamental units of life, meaning that they are the smallest living thing. It also provides a direction for the work of many biologists, physicians that study life processes and genetics and diseases. So cell theory really lays out a baseline of how cells affect our daily lives, how we can look at cures for diseases by looking at cellular structure as opposed to just treating the symptoms. Same thing with genetics. Okay. There are two main types of cells, broken down into two categories, and they're both pictured for you here, a prokaryotic cell and a eukaryotic cell. Eukaryotic cells have a nucleus. That is the primary distinguishing factor of a eukaryotic cell. It has a nucleus as well as other membrane-bound organelles. And in this picture, you can see some of the other membrane-bound organelles, like vacuoles, Golgi bodies, lysosomes, mitochondria. Those are things that only eukaryotic cells have. But the primary difference is a nucleus. The other type of cell, eukaryotic cells mean true. Eu means true, and karyon means nucleus. So eukaryotic means a true nucleus. Eukaryotic cells can range in size from very tiny. They can be eukaryotic unicellular organisms like amoebas, or they can work together, many eukaryotic cells can, to make large plants and animals. You're made of eukaryotic cells. Anything that has more than one cell is made of eukaryotic cells. And these are some slides of different types of muscle, and you can even see the little nucleus in most of these cells. Eukaryotic cells tend to be larger than prokaryotic cells. And prokaryotic cells are those that do not have a nucleus. Those are things like bacteria, where the DNA just kind of floats around in the cytoplasm. It doesn't have a really sturdy case enclosing the DNA like this eukaryotic cell does. Eukaryotic cells are larger. They have developed specialized packaging and transport mechanisms. It's just a lot of different pieces working together, whereas a prokaryotic cell has really only a cell membrane, cytoplasm, and ribosomes, and then the DNA floating along in there. Prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus, and really the only example that's practical for you of a prokaryotic cell is bacteria. Here's a picture of bacteria on this slide. This is the DNA floating around here in the middle. There's cytoplasm filling it up. These little dots here are ribosomes. They're not membrane bound, so they're just made basically of RNA. And then it's surrounded by a plasma membrane. They can have things to help them move, like flagella or cilia, but mostly it's just the membrane and cytoplasm and DNA. They can also have a cell wall on the outside, but not all of them do. Pro means before, and karyon means nucleus, so prokaryote means before a nucleus. These are often thought to be more primitive organisms. They're only unicellular, so anything that has more than one cell that's big enough for you to see with the naked eye is going to be eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells can be broken down into two groups, animal cells and plant cells. Many people confuse plant cells with prokaryotic, but that is not the case. Both animal cells and plant cells are eukaryotic cells. Really, the only type of prokaryotic organisms that you need to know are bacteria. So we're going to talk about the differences between the different types of eukaryotic cells, animal and plant cells. In general, animal cells have more of a spherical shape, whereas plant cells have more of a rectangular shape. That is not always the case. There's plenty of animal cells that are square and plenty of plant cells that are circular. But when you look at the pictures, typically they are going to be portrayed in this manner, as animal cells being more circular and plant cells more square. Also, if you look at plant cells on slides throughout this unit, you're going to see them mostly looking kind of like a brick wall, where many of the cells are lined up together and they're very rectangular in shape. Some other differences. Both plant and animal cells have vacuoles, but in plant cells, there's one large central vacuole. That large central vacuole is shown here, this big one right here, and it holds primarily water. That's what allows the plant cell to maintain its shape. So if the plant starts to run out of water, and it uses the water in here, this will shrivel up and cause the plant to wilt. In animal cells, they have lots of smaller vacuoles. These are used to hold a lot of different things like proteins or carbohydrates or fats. They're both used for storage. Plant cells use their central vacuole primarily for water storage, and animal cells use many smaller vacuoles for storage of a lot of different things. An organelle that animal cells have and plant cells do not is a centriole. And to me, the centrioles kind of look like churros. They're found only in animal cells, and they're used for cellular division. So here's a centriole here. This is a centriole from the side, and this is a centriole kind of cut in half. And these are used to send out spindle fibers in cell division. We'll do that in Unit 3. So we'll come back to this organelle later on in this semester, so make sure that you can remember this for a later time. Plant cells don't have these, only animal cells do. Something that plant cells have but animal cells do not is a cell wall. And a cell wall is a tough but porous boundary on the outside of the cell membrane. It's found only in plant cells and some bacteria, but not in animal cells. So plant cells have both a cell membrane and a cell wall, whereas animal cells have only a cell membrane. Plant cells also have chloroplasts, and these chloroplasts are used for photosynthesis. We'll talk in detail about photosynthesis in Unit 4 of this semester. Right now you just need to know that animal cells do not have chloroplasts, plant cells do. Plant cells contain this chlorophyll inside of their chloroplasts that allow them to capture energy from the sunlight. We don't have those, and we can't capture energy from the sunlight, so we can't go outside and absorb energy from the sun. We have to eat it in our food. Animal cells don't have chloroplasts, and they don't have chlorophyll. If we did, we would be green, like the Hulk. The last difference between animal cells and plant cells is in division. In plant cells, they form a cell plate while dividing. It's a hard plate that forms between the two new nuclei, so the nuclei split into two, and a barrier forms, a new cell wall forms in between them. Animal cells don't have cell walls, so they use the centrioles, remember the little churro-looking things right here, to help them pull apart the DNA to the very opposite pole so it can just pinch in half. That's all that we have for today on cells. If you would please scroll down to the bottom of your page and continue working on the assignments there for the rest of this week. Please email your instructor or message me through the Blackboard system if you have any questions. Thank you.